Hi, I'm Roger Sadowsky from Sadowsky Guitars in New York City. I wanted to talk to you about what makes a Sadowsky bass special. When you go into a good music store, especially one that has a bass department, most of the basses look like Fenders. So, what makes a Sadowsky different? What makes a Sadowsky special? I think part of the answer to that question is my own personal history and my story. I started building acoustic guitars in 1972, and in 1974, I took over the repair shop for a large music store outside of Philadelphia. At that time, I was doing mostly mods and upgrades, and my clients were really the majority of the session musicians who were doing record dates, jingle dates, and doing Broadway shows and live gigs. My typical mod approach at that time was to take their Fenders and improve the fingerboards, the fretwork, shield the electronics, upgrade hardware, and finally to install my active tone circuit. Now, the first active tone circuit I used was made by a group of guys out in San Francisco called Stars Guitars, and it was simply a treble boost and a bass boost. There was no cut, there was no mid control. I immediately got feedback from the players that for the first time they could hear themselves in the mix, separate from the kick drum, or how well they cut through live as well. Now, I just want to mention that in 1979, you could not walk into a recording studio in New York City with anything but a Fender bass. Union directory, there were two chapters, acoustic bass and Fender bass. A lot of the sessions were jingle sessions. They were short, 45 minutes long, and an engineer was not spending 10 or 15 minutes dialing in, recording a bass he had never recorded before. So it was clearly a Fender world then, and to be honest, it's clearly a Fender world today as well. So that put a lot of pressure on me to build my instruments in the Fender style in order to gain acceptance by the players and by the engineers and front of house sound guys. So after using the Stars preamp for a couple of years, they closed up their shop and suggested I use a Bartolini preamp, which was very similar to theirs, and that was the Bartolini TCT. Now, the unique thing about these preamps is that they were based on transistors, and the transistors in the solid state world are almost the equivalent of tubes in the sense that they have a very warm and natural sound. Almost all the other preamps on the market today are made with what's called op amps, and that's what enables them to cut and boost, and what enables them to have a mid control as well. I never felt the need for that mid control. And when you boost the treble and bass on a Sadowsky preamp, you're attenuating the mids at about 500 hertz, and that's clearly what makes it sit so well in the mix. The one thing I did do over time is, since the treble on zero was flat, some people wanted a warmer tone. So I then started adding what I call the VTC, which is a passive vintage tone control, and that added even greater tone versatility to my instruments. So one of the things I observed while doing all these mods in the early 80s was some of the basses were just wonderful after I was done with all of my work, and some of them didn't meet my expectations. And I was trying to figure out what was making the difference here. And by 1982, I had concluded that electric solid body basses are still acoustic instruments, and the better they sound acoustically, the better they sounded amplified. And those basses that sounded acoustically the best were also the ones that were lighter in weight. So again, I became convinced by 82 that these were still acoustic instruments, and the better they sounded acoustically, the better they sounded through the amp. And so I specialized on using lighter weight woods. In the late 90s, I started chambering my bodies because I could not receive body wood as light as I needed and wanted. So by chambering the interior of the body and then putting a top on it, I was able to achieve the lighter weight and acoustic resonance that I always wanted. It wasn't long before the bass publications, the magazines, we still had them at that time, recognized me as the pioneer of what we now would refer to as the Super J bass. And that is an instrument based on the Fender jazz bass, but elevated and raising the bar and having an active tone circuit. I've used this circuit ever since 1980, and they have been very well received. Actually, one of my first customers who got my treble bass boost circuit was Marcus Miller, and he thanked me at that time for giving him the Marcus Miller sound. And that's the greatest compliment I could have received. By the mid 80s, the vintage market had taken off. And a lot of the Fenders I had previously modified would be considered what is now considered a vintage instrument. And that means one that's in original condition. So aside from doing my preamp installs on what we call player basses, ones that had already been modded or refinished, on basses that were still original, I stopped doing my mods because it would devalue them as vintage guitars. So by 1982, I was building more Sadowsky basses that incorporated everything I brought to the original design of the Leo Fender. Now let's talk more about the preamp. As I mentioned before, being transistor based, it has a warm and natural tone. By 1990, I wanted to develop my first outboard preamp. Basically a pedal that if you had a Fender or any other bass, you could plug into and get the Sadowsky sound. I knew that Bartolini couldn't supply me well at that point. Now, there was a guy down the hall from me named Alex Aguilar who was doing amp repairs and building custom amps. And this was before Alex started Aguilar Amplifiers. And Alex redesigned my preamp based on the previous circuits I had used. And I've been using this design ever since 1990. By the late 80s, I was doing a lot of work in Japan in terms of making my basses and selling them to a distributor in Japan. They hired a gentleman early on who used to own Atelier Z basses, who was inspired by my work and wanted the opportunity to work with me. So my distributor hired him, and he spent 10 months in New York City working by my side with the intention of going back to Japan and being my authorized technician. And after a couple of years, we decided to start doing a bass in Japan that would be a more cost-effective option for people who couldn't afford one of my New York City basses. We started the Metro line production in Japan in 2003. And that continued until 2019. The last 2 years of that, we also had our Metro Express, also made in Japan, for 2 years. And between the Metro line and the Metro Express, we sold over 14,000 Japanese-made instruments. But at that time, I realized that my distributor, he primarily was only concerned with the Japanese market, and I had to handle all the sales outside of Japan. And I still want to be at my workbench, okay? That's my happy place. So I decided to look for a new licensee, one who had a great factory and one who had worldwide distribution. And after pondering this for a couple of years, I woke up one morning and I just had a light bulb go off and tell me, Hans Peter from Warwick is your guy. There's nobody else. So I wrote to Hans Peter in 2019. It was early January, asking him if he would like to be my partner in my production basses. And a few hours later, I got an email from him that he was so excited. And so in January of 2020, we started the Metro line production, now being made in Germany at the most amazing factory I've ever seen anywhere in the world where I've traveled. Then we added the Metro Express, which would be a Chinese instrument. And our target was approximately $1,000 price point on the Metro Express and a $3,500 and up price point on the German Metro lines. And so I have one of each on each of my sides. The black bass here is a Metro line made in Germany. And the white bass here is a Metro Express made in China. And I'm very proud of both of these instruments. And I'm humbled and gratified that people with different budgets can still afford to get a bass that has the Sadowsky feel and sound. So in conclusion, I want to show you that Sadowsky is much more than a Fender copy. It's been praised by engineers in studios, front of house soundmen, and bass players for over 45 years. My relationship with Warwick has enabled us to reach a much wider audience at various price points. Nicholas Wilfer and I are both committed to making the best bass we can at the various price points we're working in, whether it's the Metro Express from China, the Metro line from Germany, which include the master built and the custom shop, and then what we make here in New York City in the Sadowsky NYC custom shop. We're committed to making a difference in your life with the quality of the instrument that makes a difference to you. And I thank you for your support and talk to you soon.